I've been very vocal about this, that economic precarization, which is more rampant in the core countries, and the political oppression, which is more overt in the peripheral countries, are two sides of the same coin. They have one purpose, one main purpose, which is to disempower the knowledge-producing labor force. We are disempowered. We have learned hopelessness. We have internalized it.
You're listening to This Authoritarian Life, a podcast in which we explore everyday human stories to make sense of authoritarian politics. My name is Krzysztof Sombati.
And I'm Erdem Evren. Welcome back to This Authoritarian Life. This is the fourth episode of season 2. We continue talking to our guests on what we call the frontlines of authoritarianism. And today we are exploring what has happened to universities, in what ways they cease to become places that protect critical thinking, and in what ways they come under pressure from both political repression and economic precarization. And as far as we are concerned, this is not only about a couple of well-educated people losing their jobs or a couple of universities getting more authoritarian, but for better or worse, universities actually reproduce societies. They train, doctors, lawyers, teachers. They produce research that informs public policy, once again, for better or worse. So when academics are silenced, when they are rendered disposable, this has far-reaching consequences. And this is precisely what we are seeing in Turkey, in Germany, in the United States, and in many other places. That space is very visibly shrinking. And Krzysztof and I actually know all this personally. This is a topic that is very close to our hearts. We've spent years in the academic system. I worked as a researcher and a lecturer for over a decade before leaving. Krzysztof is still inside the system, but he's very ambivalent. But more importantly, we've witnessed colleagues, self-censoring themselves. We've seen, critical voices being pushed out of academia, and we saw how those precarious contracts make people afraid to speak, actually. And so this episode is a way to make sense of all this and to make sense of our own disquiet and frustration. And to help us do that, we actually invited someone who has lived through political repression as an academic in Turkey, but who has also studied the structural conditions that make universities so vulnerable. So our guest today is Aslı Vatansever. Welcome to This Authoritarian Life, Aslı. So Aslı is a sociologist of work by training. She was dismissed from her academic position in Istanbul after she signed the Peace Petition of the Academics for Peace, about which we'll talk about more. She has published widely in Turkish, English, German. One prominent, for example, publication is a book titled At the Margins of Academia, Exile, Precariousness, and Subjectivity. And she's currently working at the Bard College Berlin at an administrative capacity.
Welcome, Aslı.
Hi, Krzysztof. Hi, Erdem. Thank you. Thanks for the nice welcoming introduction.
So let me ask the first question, and it's going to be a very simple one. What drew you to enter academia and become an academic? Was there an experience or that you can recount?
And this is supposed to be your easy question. Oh my God. What drove me to become an academic? Interesting. I mean, I got into sociology after high school by sheer coincidence, actually. I had I had graduated from the German high school in Istanbul, which is a more STEM focused high school, as is the case for, the German system in general. And all I knew was that I didn't want to study anything with math or any type of STEM thing in it. And actually, my mom had prepared my university application list. And for some reason, I got into sociology, and I got the news, and I was like, what? Did I have sociology on my list? I don't even know what that is, And I started studying sociology. And like in my second semester in my freshman year, I was so smitten. I was like so above and beyond myself. I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. Like it makes me understand so much more about the world that we live in. And I found myself drawn to sociology. And, starting with my second freshman semester, I didn't want to do anything else in my life. That was the case. I was just drawn to sociology, actually. And yeah, that's how I got duped into this Ponzi scheme.
What year was that?
That was 2000, and it escalated for me after September 11, 2001, when I was taking a sociology of culture class with Meral Özbek, whom Erdem you might be familiar with. She's a prominent figure in Turkish sociology. And she was my professor, and she's amazing. And September 11th had just happened, and we were discussing in class. And after class, she just beckoned me to herself, and she said, "You know what? You're asking very smart questions. I think you can do something, and go and just write an article on September 11th for me." I'm like, "What?" Like I didn't even know how to write an article. I just, imitated referencing systems that I saw in books, and like I was like totally clueless and was just pushed into it by Maren Özbek. And I wrote my first article on September 11, and it was this particular conjunction of, global events and personal interest that drove me into it.
And what was the university landscape like back then? Were also some pressures already palpable that erupted later or became much more pronounced? Or what was your experience like?
As an undergrad, by the time when I was an undergrad, it was early 2000s, and I was at Mimar Sinan Sociology, which is known to be a very leftist department and institution. At least in my time, it was the case. And there was nothing that we couldn't talk about in the classroom. And I have always been a very solipsistic academic. I have never been like really part of the academic networks in Turkey, with the exception of the peace academics for a brief period. So even if there were power struggles in the university context, I wouldn't have known anything about it. I was just reading and writing, and that was all I did. And I thought that academia would be like this, where you just read and write. I was totally unaware of the politics of the work relations.
So what's the first experience that you can remember where something changed, something clicked?
Where I became aware of the power relations and the politics of the whole thing.
That the atmosphere was changing towards a space in which not everything could be discussed, or you had to watch what questions you asked or what comments you formulated, or any other shift away from this freer space that you just described.
I was doing my PhD in Hamburg at the University of Hamburg, and some degree programs like gender studies started to be shut down due to funding reasons, which we all know is always a political question. What you fund and what you deny funds actually expresses where the economic interests go. And that was probably one of the first experiences that I had with, so not everything is, permissible in academia. Not everything gains the same priority as other stuff. Some programs, some research fields are obviously more profitable, and the question of what is profitable is actually decisive in what gets researched, what gets to be studied.
So this is the end of the 2000s?
That was late 2000s, yeah. Okay, just to give you a timeline, I started with my BA in 1999. I finished my BA in 2003. Then I went to Hamburg in 2004 for my master's. I finished my master's in 2006. I started with my PhD by the beginning of 2007 and finished my PhD in January 2010. So that's the timeline. Like,
Okay.
the 2000s until 2010 is the study period.
And you went back to Istanbul after you finished your PhD, or?
As soon as I finished my PhD, I went back to Istanbul because I thought, okay, the academic labor market in Germany seems very bleak. Either I stay here and, chase after postdocs, or I can go back to Turkey and get an assistant professorship at a university. And that was also the time the private universities were mushrooming. And I wasn't yet completely aware of what the private universities meant. I was actually in historical sociology back in the day. In my PhD, I worked on the incorporation of the Ottoman Empire into the capitalist world economy. That was broadly related to what is happening, of course, but not directly related to labor sociology. And I was like, okay, I can go back to Turkey and get an assistant professorship and then just, move straight forward, have a very, uncomplicated career. That was the plan. And we all know how that went.
Like, what sort of a place was that? I mean, I know, I have an idea, but it was a small private university, right?
Not so small, actually.
So small?
They're getting bigger and bigger. Now it's actually part of a conglomerate, together with some other private universities. But they were owned by a former police chief or someone like this, who also had high schools and primary schools. It was like a chain. And then, I started working there as an assistant professor. And I quickly understood that, okay, this is a teaching factory. And you can't really expect the students to have the interests, the level of interest and the level of engagement that you would expect from a university student. But then something even worse happened around 2014. The owner went bankrupt. I don't know how that happened in a private university where you're still, getting enrollment fees, which were not low, by the way. But somehow they managed to get bankrupt. And then the university got sold to another group, which is known as the Çelik Group, who are close to the AKP government. I mean, these are the type of guys who are the man for every period, actually. They just bend and reshape themselves according to any conjuncture. But anyway, so they bought the university, and then you really got to feel the commodification, the ruthless commodification of everything, which actually brings us back to why I even started studying academic precarity.
Yeah, tell us about that, because that's what you experienced, right? So it was around you.
Yeah. I mean, I literally started studying academic precarity by, suffering it in my own life. Well, I had started working on the precariat and precarization in the aftermath of the Gezi movement, or during the Gezi movement, where I was very active and realized parallels between the emerging proletariat of the 19th century and the emerging precariat of the 21st century. I don't want to bore you with the details of that, but we can also talk about that. Anyway, I had started working on the precariat in 2013. And then during this acquisition process of the university by another group, suddenly we were forced to sign contracts which had like absolutely ultimately worse conditions, worse terms than the previous contracts that we had, and with no salary indication. Like we were literally forced to sign contracts where there was no salary. And I had a huge fight with the university administration, with their board. I said, what the hell is this? I'm not going to sign this. I mean, there's no salary on it. And they were like, yeah, it's because of the inflation rates. They're not clear yet. Don't you trust us? And I'm like, of course I don't trust you. And I mean, this is a work relationship. This is an employment relationship. I don't have to trust you. This is not a personal relationship. And this is why we have contracts in the first place. You cannot build it on trust. It has to have a legality. And especially considering the fact that you are imposing upon us worse terms, you are forcing us to use stamp cards when going in and out of the university. You are imposing upon us increased work hours. It shows me that you don't trust me either. Why should I trust you? I'm not going to sign this contract. And you know what I'm going to do? If you fire me, I will go to court and sue you because I'm justified to do so. You're forcing me to sign a contract where there's no salary. We had this huge fight. And then we negotiated. I made them put a clause on my contract. But that was like a breach of relationships. And I was going crazy, by the way. I fell into such a depression in the face of the futility of all academic work, the emptying of the teaching experience, the devaluation of my labor at the hands of these scumbags. And I was like literally kicking against the walls in my office in between classes and like having nervous breakdowns. I was sharing a floor with colleagues from the psychology department, and one of them literally came up to me one day and said, I keep hearing you scream in your office, and I'm afraid that you might do something to yourself. Do you want to talk about this? Like, the situation was that dire. And I had a colleague at the psychology department, Meral Gezici Yalçın, who is a social psychologist. And we became comrades and buddies, and we kept, venting about the situation during lunch. And then we were like, you know what? We're not that desperate. We're not that hopeless. We have a weapon. It might not be much, but it is the only weapon that we have, and this is research. Why don't we go out and do some field research on the working conditions at private universities in Turkey, at least in Istanbul, because we didn't have research funding, obviously, and we had to limit it. But, Istanbul is the place where the private universities congregate anyway. So we did that research, and man, the situation was even worse than we thought. Like, it was so abysmal, so pathetic. And a way people tried to justify this
But
pathetic
can you
situation.
describe because we also have, people who are not aware of what this looks like. So what does this abysmal precarity look like from the perspective of someone experiencing it?
Yeah, well, first of all, at private universities, you don't have tenure, you have annual contracts. So you're perpetually precarious. And every year around June, people fear for their livelihoods because this is the time when the contracts either get renewed or terminated. And in most cases, people were forced to work, twice or thrice as much as 40 hours a week. They had to teach over 15 hours a week. They had absolutely no time, no funding, no support for any research. Most of them did not even get, inflation adjustments on their salaries for years. Most of them signed contracts without salaries at the beginning of their careers. Most of them signed contracts and were not paid for 6 months after they started working at a university. We ourselves, during that crisis of bankruptcy of the university, had a period where we did not get paid for 3 months. So during that field research, we understood, okay, this is part and parcel of the whole business, because everybody's going through that, obviously, for one reason or the other. And people have found ways to cope with that and justify that because of this inner disempowerment. You feel so powerless because, one of the university owners, the owner of the Okan University, has this famous quote where he said, well, there are a lot of universities for you and there are a lot of professors for me. This is their mentality. You're like so disposable, and the university administrations are so disinterested in the content of what you have to offer. You're just a cog in a machine, and anyone can teach what you teach. Like I'm a labor sociologist, or when I started, I was a historical sociologist, and I was expected to teach European integration just because I had a master's in that. That kind of thing. So Maren and I saw this bleak picture, and we named our book. We published a book with the findings of that research, and the book is called Ready to Teach Anything. So it came out in 2015. So that was the period, and that was a personal and structural experience that I had that actually pushed me towards academic precarity. And I haven't stopped working on it ever since, because I never not been precarious.
But on top of what you're describing came the political repression, the unprecedented political repression, let's call it, the Academics for Peace Petition. So can you very briefly kind of explain for our listeners what it was about and what happened and how it's affected you personally?
Yeah, well, Ardam, you probably remember in summer 2015, after the elections, there was this breeze of optimism when HDP made it into the parliament. And we were all very happy. And
this is
in Turkey,
this is the pro-Kurdish party. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And in Turkey, you should always be cautiously optimistic. You should never be too happy. I guess our mistake was to be too happy for a moment. And immediately thereafter came the offensive in the Kurdish populated towns and long curfews and civilian deaths. And I never worked on the Kurdish movement or the so-called Kurdish conflict. That's not my area of expertise. But of course, we were getting news from the Kurdish populated towns, albeit in a limited way, but that was even enough. And the situation got so bleak that when in January I saw the petition, I was like, hey, this is like, the minimum of what we can do. Like, this is the least we can do. At least sign this. And this is how I decided to sign it. I don't know the background of the petition, actually. I'm sure that the Peace Academics group, the network, had been talking about it and preparing the petition for a long time. But for me, it was more of a, personal decision to sign it.
Once again, to contextualize it, more than 1,000 academics from all around Turkey signed this petition. And the government's response was to start prosecutions. Hundreds of academics, both junior and senior academics, were fired from their position. There were very serious death threats. So it was kind of the most serious, I think, crisis that the academia in Turkey has gone through. Even under the conditions of military coups, like even in the 80s or in the 60s or even before, I think the figures were not that high. The figures referring to those who lost their jobs or became prosecuted or things like that. And 4 academics actually spent a short period of time in prison. They were detained and released after a couple of months later.
So, can we ask you what the repercussions were for you and on you?
Well, I signed the petition in January 2016. I was in the first round. And like I said, when I signed it, I I thought it was something like a change.org campaign. And I did not find the language particularly harsh. But then again, I have a propensity to harsher language. And, I thought, okay, this is the least we can do. I'm just sitting here comfortably in Istanbul. I might as well just, sign one petition to show where my heart is at. And, at first, I didn't take any reaction seriously when a mafia boss, Sedat Peker, threatened us. I made jokes of it on Facebook. I shared the petition on my Facebook page saying, hey, people, sign this. This is the type of, middle class naivety, romantic, rebellious attitude, which is sometimes also stupid, of course. But I was totally under the spell of it. And then we went to the Çağlayan courthouse to make a complaint about Sedat Peker's threat. And the press was there. So apparently I got on TV, and the rector of the university I was working at saw that on TV, and he flipped out. He was like, instead of coming to office, we were expected to be in the office every day from 9 to 5. She was not at work, and she was there making a complaint against Sedat Peker, and she signed a petition, and they sent me a disciplinary investigation. That was the first reaction that I got from the university. And I wrote a reply to them saying, hey, I'm not going to defend myself, fuck you. And then we went to Diyarbakir was it in March? I guess the first academic watch. We used to call them academic watches. Every month or every couple months, a group of peace academics went to Kurdish populated towns to say, hey, we're here watching this. So we went to Diyarbakir together, and we made a press release there. And I read the press release, but it didn't get published anywhere on mainstream media. It was something I can't even find it on the internet. It's so, underground internet. It's only got published in underground Kurdish newspapers. And somehow the rectorate got wind of it, which shows that they were actually surveilling me at that time, that they had started monitoring my behaviors. And then came the second disciplinary investigation. Again, I said, fuck you. And then I had a meeting with the rector. I said, hey, you know what? You keep threatening me, and I'm sick of this. We can, negotiate a good exit, and I can leave, because I'm emotionally not bound to this institution anyway. And obviously you just want to cause problems. Let's settle. And he refused it. And then they sent me a notice saying, hey, by the end of this day, empty your office and get out. That was April 29, 2016, in the middle of the semester. And yeah, so I got fired. But I was still so agitated. And that was the time of very intense solidarity among peace academics. There were meetings every week. We were constantly plotting something. And I got fired. And a couple of weeks later, I found in my bank account money from peace academics, because that was the type of solidarity we had. Whenever someone got fired, the peace academics started collecting money among themselves to help them, sustain their livelihoods for a while at least. we were in touch with our colleagues abroad, and they were frantically trying to get positions for us or scholarships for us. And at that time, the Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin offered a small, short-term scholarship for peace academics who lost their jobs. And I think Erdem and Turkish colleagues have negotiated this with the institute anyway. So Erdem informed the group. I applied to that, and so this is how I got back to Germany. That was a very lively period. It was great the first year.
I suppose it was not very easy to leave Turkey, but everything was happening fast and you had to make a very quick decision, but there was no question in you that you were going to leave.
No, actually, at the beginning, I didn't even think of leaving. I didn't want to leave. I even wrote an article for the Deutsche Universitätszeitung where I explain why we don't want to leave and we're not leaving. That was my, attitude. But then after a while, of course, you think to yourself, all right, you know what? I mean, if I stay here, I can't work at the moment. I wasn't decreed yet at that moment. I was just fired from the university, but it was clear that no other university would hire me either. And you think to yourself, okay, maybe I should go and earn some money so that I can send some back to Turkey to, unemployed people. Like this was the circulation that we had. So, because it was clear that more and more of us would become unemployed in no time. And, I got fired in April. And paradoxically, I got my associate professorship in October, months after I got fired. And, at the time I thought, okay, I might as well go to Berlin for 4 months, earn some money because I'm unemployed, and also have a little peace of mind to maybe write an article. And that's how I got here. But then when I was here, a statutory decree came out in February 2017 and banned me from public service and declared my passport as invalid. And then I couldn't go back.
Okay, so this episode had really vast repercussions for the whole of Turkish academia. It was really a game changer, right?
Yeah, it was like Erdem said, it was probably the widest, biggest purge that happened at the universities. But the repercussions, the personal repercussions varied, of course, for each and every one of us, and also depending on the university that you were working at. I was working in an academic sweatshop, and I had absolutely no principles. So they fired me, and then they also made sure to get my name into the decree so that I can't, sue them, so that they can show to the court that I was a terrorist anyway, and it was a justified process. I cannot attest to what happened at other universities because I wasn't part of them. But of course, you talk with colleagues and you hear how collegial relations get tense between people. And then you have a situation where the government made unlawful appointments of rectorates in universities. And there was a huge clash between university administrations and faculty. So, yeah, of course, the situation was and continues to be tense.
Let's fast forward a bit. So you came to Germany, you had different fellowships or temporary positions as an academic. But what I want to come at is another petition, actually. So after the genocide in Gaza started, there was another kind of petition, let's call it the Gaza petition, once again by academics who were protesting against Israel's contact and also the German state's kind of complicity and silence, even though the wording of that kind of petition was also quite mild as far as I'm concerned, for example. But what I want to ask is that was there a sense of déjà vu for you in terms of the reaction of the media and the reaction of the academic deans and presidents and departments? To what degree was it comparable?
Erdem, just to set the record straight, I don't know about the Gaza petition that you're talking about. I signed a petition where we criticized police intervention on campuses. It wasn't directly related to Gaza. It was to show solidarity with the student encampments and protests. And it came out after the police intervention. After the police intervention, that was invited by the rectorate of the Vrije Universiteit, by the way. And the petition said, hey, we're against police intervention on campuses. The students are actually using their right to protest peacefully. And any university administration that invites police to the campus is complicit in whatever is going on politically, globally at the moment. That was the gist of the, and that was the angle that the petition was playing on. I signed that petition. And of course, I had a huge déjà vu, especially when the toilet paper, that is the Bild newspaper, published our names as traitors. I was like, oh my God, I managed to become a traitor in 2 different countries within a decade. I mean, how much can I want in life? Like, this is like the biggest source of pride in my life. But in the meantime, I thought, okay, where will I go to exile from now? You know, because obviously Germany is about to deport me as well. So what's going to happen? And it actually, all jokes aside, it only confirmed what I've been saying all along. Every state has its red lines. And Germany is no less of an authoritarian state than Turkey. It is just smarter. And it has the luxuries of being a core country within a capitalist world economy. You know, stupid peripheral regimes like Turkey use overt oppression, which makes them more vulnerable, by the way, which is their Achilles heels, because you know what you're fighting against. So it also provokes, I mean, they're so overtly oppressive that they also provoke resistance. Whereas in core countries like Germany, which are more covertly authoritarian, you manufacture consent to such a degree and invoke the impression among people that the system is very competent and democratic, that there's not even resistance. You know, I hate to quote Chomsky in any context, since I saw him having a nice chat with Epstein in his private jet. But to say it with Chomsky, the most successfully authoritarian systems are those that make you believe that they're not. You know, the ones that limit the boundaries of what is expressible, but then allow very lively debate within those limits. And Germany is a prime example of that. And we have seen at the latest, after this little petition crisis that we had, that the emperor is naked here as well. And he looks quite despicable when naked. No less despicable than the one in Turkey.
So the reactions of the university administration were very much comparable in the 2 cases. That's what you're saying, right?
At the moment I signed that petition, I was working at Bard College Berlin, which is I have to grant them this, which is a very progressive institution and also vocally critical of what's going on in the Middle East. At least there is no censorship whatsoever at Bard College Berlin on its faculty's freedom of expression in that regard. And the university administration itself is actually pretty much on the same page. So I did not experience that. So, I mean, I didn't have any firsthand experience in that regard, but I know that especially the German state universities have been very oppressive during the whole thing.
Yeah, that's what I meant, because you mentioned the Freie, so I was more referring to the administration there.
someone who works at Freie would be more apt to answer this
Yeah, but
question. But
I mean, the fact that they banned encampments, they invited the police to the
yeah,
campus, they turned a blind eye to the fact that the police basically terrorized these students, that they actually wanted to propose to change the legislation. Until then it wasn't so easy
you
to
know,
actually kick a student out of university
you know what
based
I
on
think, Ardam? I mean, Freie is one example. What I found more dramatic and more frightening during the whole thing was the scandal around Bettina Stark-Watzinger, who was a federal minister of education. And it came out that she released a memo, like a confidential memo in the ministry that advised to deny funding to academics who support Palestine, or I don't even want to say support Palestine, who are just against genocide, period. I mean, I'm not supporting anyone in particular. I'm simply against genocide, any type of genocide. That's it. So she released this memo that literally said, deny funding to these people, which is no different than, the civil death that we talked about in Turkey in the aftermath of the peace petition, especially considering the academic labor market in Germany, where 92% of academic workers are dependent on external funding. And no one has a permanent contract except for the tenured professors who make up only 8% of the entire workforce. What does it mean to deny funding to those people? You're literally condemning them to a professional occupational death. This is like a Berufsverbot in Nazi times. I think this is much more tragic than the individual reactions of university administrations. I mean, the Freie Universität, the administration of Freie, was apparently acting in line with the federal attitude. That was the Staatsräson at play. That was how the federal state of Germany is handling the situation in general.
I think we just arrived at a really important point, because what you're highlighting is kind of this link between precarization in German academia and how that supports authoritarian tendencies. So I think let's speak a bit more about that. What are other mechanisms, or what are the other ways in which these two tendencies can come together?
Well, you don't even need any other mechanisms. These two actually work perfectly well in conjunction and create a situation where people are afraid to speak up for a lot of reasons in many contexts. I've been very vocal about this, and I've been saying this all along. I based all of my, publications on this argument, actually, that the economic precarization, which is more rampant in the core countries, and the political oppression, which is more overt in the peripheral countries, are two sides of the same coin. And most of the time, they proceed in conjunction, they proceed hand in hand. And, that's what I was saying before when I said Germany is the more competent authoritarian state, actually, because they make it look like, oh, this is not political oppression. It's just, the funding situation. The market actually eliminates those research fields. The market does not think that your article is fit for being published in the top tier journals. The market decides that your project proposal is not, attractive at the moment. But then a political shift happens, which is pivotal, and suddenly the mask is off, and you see, oh, so it's also about political oppression. So these two mechanisms, political oppression, economic precarization, are, like I said, the two sides of the same coin, and they have one purpose, one main purpose, which is to disempower the knowledge producing labor force. And we are disempowered. We have learned hopelessness, we have internalized it, and it expresses itself in self-censorship. It manifests itself in, trying to wrap your research proposals in a market-friendly way, trying to avoid some, explosive terms, trying not to make waves in the classroom, or it also manifests itself in personal collegial relationships. Even in my own experience, where you're afraid to speak up against workplace misconduct, harassment, mobbing, devaluation. This is where we're at.
And also in your publications, you talk a lot about the exiled academics kind of position within all these relations. So on the one hand, in the media, in public discourses, academics like you, scholars at risk, let's call them, are treated as these like strange creatures, or like there is much
endangered species.
Endangered species, and there's much pity and worry coming from the German mainstream, if you like. And I think as someone who already spoke fluent German, you yourself had many interviews with German newspapers and publications. And can you talk about this a bit? Like, was this really how they saw you or saw exile academics from the very beginning? And also in your own work, how do you kind of conceptualize exile academics fit in this picture?
Well, this is the discourse that is being created around this topic, and it serves mainly two purposes, in my opinion, Ardam. By introducing or framing displaced academics as an endangered species, as scholars at risk, first of all, you create a quarantine zone of, short-term risk scholarships, which work as a type of stigma in the long term, having been confined to that humanitarian bubble of non-competitive risk scholarships. First, you think, oh God, good. I mean, there are a lot of opportunities here. I can survive here, and people show interest in my situation. But soon you realize, okay, this is a quarantine zone. I'm being pushed towards the margins of academia, hence the title of my book, At the Margins of Academia. I'm being pushed towards the margins with no real access to where the discourse is created. I'm being treated like a museum piece behind a glass, and also having these consecutive risk scholarships in my resume will work against me long term, because no one thinks that you're good just because you got that funding. Quite the contrary. People think, oh, these are non-competitive humanitarian help type of scholarships. So this is just yet another, typical below mediocre third world country intellectual who could be interesting as an image prop for our institution for a while, 2 years if you get a Philip Schwartz scholarship, but no longer. I mean, not any longer. I mean, this helps, categorize the academic precariat into fractions. They have enough to deal with the domestic precariat, which is, hard to contain in the long term. And if you add to this growing reserve army of disposable academic labor force the displaced academics that come from third world countries like Turkey, well, we can't feed them over a long period of time. Just give them, some risk scholarships for a short while to show that we're also, socially and politically conscious, but so that we know where they're at and they should not step outside of that bubble. This is the one purpose that this discourse has. The other one is more related to the epistemological politics of the world system, I would say. By focusing only on the political humanitarian part of the situation, the core countries and the core academic systems allow themselves to hang on to, the illusion of being more progressive and, better off in terms of the academic sector. They focus on the humanitarian part and limit the discourse on political oppression and frame academic risk only in terms of overt political oppression, so that the economic brutality becomes invisible, and so that the elimination of dangerous ideas via market mechanisms in the core countries and the risks of that remain invisible.
I have a question. Obviously, this is a general argument that applies to many what you call core countries, but do you see something specific about the German system? Or are there certain things that are specific to German system that exacerbates these forms of disciplining, these forms of rendering people precarious or making political oppression invisible, if you like?
Well, of course. I mean, first of all, the German academic labor market is the worst. And this is not my personal opinion. There are studies on that. There was a study from 2016, I guess, conducted by Alexandre Afonso, which was part of an ERC study, where he categorized academic labor markets in four types. And the German academic labor market was one of a kind. It was insecure and closed, meaning closed to non-German degree holders, and also precarious to an unprecedented degree. The German academic labor market is the way it is right now, probably also due to the fact that they cannot rely on student fees, so they have to outsource academic labor force in order to decrease the costs. And the entire system is dependent on external funding. As I said before, 92% of the academic labor force works on fixed-term contracts. And according to the statistics of the Deutsche Gewerkschaftsbund, only 5% of PhD holders have a prospect of tenure. And these are certainly not foreign degree holders or foreigners who belong to that 5%. So the German system has its idiosyncrasies, which have a historical background, but also have emerged during the neoliberalization process. In the historical background, we see the chair system, which is a feudal relic that persists. And despite the Network for Decent Work in Academia, which is a nationwide umbrella network for precarious researchers, despite their pushing for the abolition of the chair system, we don't see anything happening in that front. I mean, the chair system persists, which is ridiculous, by the way, where a handful of tenured professors, chair holders, decide on the fate of entire institutions, departments, research agendas, hirings and firings and everything. And this is also super paradoxical for a discourse that focuses so much on democracy that they don't see any problem with the undemocratic essence of this all. I mean, imagine a system where 92% of the workforce consists of precarious researchers, and they are not a part of any decision-making mechanism. 8%, a handful of professors, a handful of chairholders decide on everything. How democratic is that?
Not very much. And I think both of us have experienced this, and we would have stories to tell from our own former universities. But should we come to maybe the last batch of questions that deal with, what can be done in this situation? And I know I've heard that you're not one of the hopeful ones. But, still you've mentioned some initiatives, even in Germany, where, as you very well explained, this internal differentiation into status groups of basically, a very precarious proletariat of knowledge producers prevents alliance building. But still, are there any initiatives that you can recall which, make a push towards alliances between precarious academics? Is there anything that you can mention that tries to overhaul this, as you said, very anti-democratic structure?
And maybe to add to that, can learning and teaching and knowledge production in general kind of thrive and flourish in outside of university settings?
Okay, I'm gonna get to that, but first of all, just to make one point clear, when I said I don't want to, I'm usually more disinclined to talk about hope or the upsides of the situation in general. I didn't mean it in a way that, resistance is futile. It's not, of course not. I mean, if it were, we wouldn't be talking about this here. I mean, it wouldn't make any sense for us to talk about anything. If any resistance is futile, we might as well just die. I might as well just throw myself off the balcony, which sometimes seem very attractive. Of course, it's important to create venues of resistance and maintain them no matter what. It's just I usually resist the urge at academic conferences and workshops and discussions to come up with something positive. Every time I'm at a conference or in a workshop or in any type of, panel, people conclude by saying, so let's finish this off with a positive note. And I'm like, it's not my job to paint a pink picture. We're not in a TED talk here. I'm not some influencer. I'm not some wellness guru. It's not my job to, finish off in a positive note. No, we should sometimes sit in this uncomfortable truth that the situation is dire. Of course, I'm all for, optimism of the will. But, optimism of the will does not mean, distorting the truth and trying frantically to find something positive about the situation. Sometimes there's nothing positive about the situation, and you have to fight to create that positive element. And this is what the precarious researchers initiatives are doing, actually. And I think this is what you wanted to know, Christoph. Yes, there are very valuable initiatives, and we have seen that they also achieve some incremental successes along the way. Like, you might remember the hashtag Ich bin Hanna campaign a couple of years back that actually swept the entire German academia. And it has done wonders in shifting the entire discourse. Or the Network for Decent Work in Academia, the Netzwerk für gute Arbeit in der Wissenschaft that I just mentioned, the nationwide umbrella network of precarious researchers initiatives in Germany. Sometimes it's not so visible, and what they do might not be as spectacular as street fights with the police, but they have managed successfully to change the discourse on academic employment relations over the last decade. And they have made people understand that academics are workers. They are not beyond and above wage labor. And we have to fight for our workers' rights in the first place. Academic freedom and research and teaching and the interests of the students, these are very nice ideological packages that you can wrap your argument in. But at the end of the day, you have to fight for your rights as a worker. You are a fucking worker, nothing more. And sometimes you're even less than a worker because we can't find jobs. Sometimes I'm not even a proletarian because I don't have a job. So these precarious researchers initiatives have at least dismantled some of the illusions that surround academic work. And they have been very successful in this. Like I said, these accomplishments are not as spectacular as changing the system from one day to the other, which is not possible anyway. But they are changing the discourse, and it is important. To your question, Ardam, whether there might be venues of knowledge production, yes, there are, of course. There are, academic structures outside of the conventional universities, like Off University, we had mentioned, and others. And they're valuable, not the least because they keep the discussion going, and they allow for spaces where uncomfortable truths can be spoken out. Universities no longer fulfill that function entirely. Or we can also question whether the universities have ever fulfilled that function. I mean, we all know the historical ties that the university as an institution has to state. So, was there ever a golden age of university? This is also up for a discussion, but I'm not going to get into that right now. It's a very long discussion. Let me just say, yes, there are venues and they are very important. But at the end of the day, if your goal is to challenge the status quo in a meaningful way and scare them in a substantial way, I'm not sure whether this is the way to go. Because, like I said, I mean, a non universitarian venue, to what extent can it challenge the Ivy League, for example, in terms of attracting students, in terms of defining or setting the boundaries of the discourse, setting the parameters of the discourse, in terms of making itself heard? You know, the structures that you're fighting against are very powerful and all encompassing, and they also dominate the entire publishing and funding industry.
I understand that staying within the boundaries of academia in universities, etc., really has the effect of bestowing you with some kind of power that you, as part of an alternative network or non-university, whatever space, would inevitably lack. That I understand. But also, like, even staying within academia as, say, leftist, progressive, whatever you want to call it, academics, have we ever had that kind of power that is comparable to someone from Yale or someone?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, of course, we never had that type of power, even within the institutions. I mean, even if you stay within an institution, you will never have that type of power unless you have tenure. I mean, it's always a question of your proximity to power. But under these circumstances, of course, we might as well say, hey, let's move completely out of this and create our own, venue. And I understand where that comes from, and I also support it on an emotional level. I just question the effectivity of it. I just ask myself whether we're also quarantining ourselves a bit by doing so. You know, you might create a bubble which feels safe for a little group of people, but changes little in real time. And also, you inevitably face the most banal concern, which is we don't have money. How will you sustain a living? At the end of the day, intellectual interests and the quest for truth and pursuit of, knowledge and whatever all fade in the face of having to pay your rent and buying groceries.
Well, once again, we are back to the conjuncture. There was a time when communist parties were funding workers' universities, and, even social democratic parties were pushing for very influential and actually relatively well-paid kind of educational initiatives. But thank you so much, Aslı, for joining us. This was
Thank you, guys.
really,
Yes.
really
was
helpful.
great.
This was really great. Thank you so much.
It was great for me too. It was really exhilarating to, get some things off my chest. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
So that's it from us for today. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
We would also like to thank our contributors: music and mastering, Shai Levy; artwork and graphics, Polina Georgescu; editing, Vera Jonas; and our in-house communications advisor, Anna Szilágyi.